have so many harp exercise books. So why do none of them have the basic exercises that I want to teach my students? Hey, I'm Samantha, I'm a professional harpist, and I also teach a lot of students, and today I'm going to be complaining about a hole in the harp resource landscape. A few years back, I was working with some students of mine, teaching them some basic harp patterns like scales, triads, and arpeggios, and I wanted to teach them to my students in different keys. Since the books that we were working from at the time didn't have those written out, I would explain to my student orally, play it for them so they know how the exercise was supposed to go, what it was supposed to look and sound like. I'd write some notes for them in their notebook, and then inevitably the following week they would come back and play the exercise incorrectly. So I thought, this is pretty inconvenient. Like, surely there must be a book somewhere out there that has these exercises written out so I can just give them to my students and we can communicate much more effectively. So I did some research, I did some digging, but I could not find a book like this. I even asked you guys on social media to see if I had missed something, but it seems like what I was looking for just did not exist. To be more specific, what I was looking for was scales, triads, and four note chords in rolled and broken form, as well as arpeggios. I wanted those to be written out in various major and minor keys, and I wanted those to include harp-specific instructions like fingerings and brackets. These books that I was throwing on the floor earlier, while awesome resources in their own right, just don't do those things. Oftentimes, instead of the basic patterns that I want, they're more what I call exercisey exercises. When I say want a scale, I just want a scale. Just notes moving up and down by steps spanning between octaves. What a lot of these books contains are a lot of different patterns of notes going in various directions and in various configurations, which, while great for your fingers, love them. Okay, I'm not knocking them. They just aren't plain and simple scales. Or some of the books do actually write out some of those basic exercises that I want, but they only do it in either C major or E flat major. And then the student is expected to transpose and figure out pedals and levers on their own, which I think is fine for some people. Obviously, harpists have been doing it for generations, but I do think for some students, especially people who are more visual learners, or for students who have never studied any music before and maybe don't even know what a scale or a triad even is, having the exercise written out can just make it so much more clear what they're expected to do. But I've gotten ahead of myself. Why is this even important in the first place? To answer that, let me take you back in time a little bit. When I was growing up playing piano, and yes, I started piano when I was 5 and didn't start harp until later when I was 14, I grew up with these technical requirements books. There was one for each grade in the Royal Conservatory of Music curriculum, which is the examining board here in Canada, and they did exactly what I'm looking for now. They spelled out scales, chords, and arpeggios, and a few other exercises in the keys and formats that were required for each exam. So growing up with these, I kind of just took them for granted as a part of learning an instrument. I didn't really realize it at the time, but they actually made me become a lot more familiar with different keys and what different scales and chords looked like. And so when I went on to study theory later on, I was actually already fairly familiar with some of the concepts. So when I started playing harp as a teenager, it didn't really strike me as strange that I didn't have one of these kinds of books because I was already very familiar with these exercises and what was expected of me for each one. But the thing is, not every harp student is coming to harp with a background in piano or any other instrument for that matter. Got a little sidekick here. But Samantha, I hear the pianists crying to me through the comments section. Pianists need these books because the fingerings are different for every exercise. On the harp, the fingerings are always the same. And yes, this is true. Because we change the pitch of a string by changing levers or pedals, the shape of each exercise and therefore the fingering stays the same between keys. However, firstly, transposing is not necessarily going to come easily for each student. Memorizing all these different key signatures and then remembering which scale they're supposed to go with may not be that easy for some students, especially when they just seem like random things that your teacher asked you to memorize one day. Secondly, playing the same shape in a different place on the harp, i.e. playing in different keys, is still really useful because those patterns, although the shape is the same, the fingerings are the same, they will look different both on the page and on the strings as well. Being comfortable with the way that different patterns look will allow students to start to recognize those same patterns in the actual music that they're playing, which is the whole point. Okay, so that brings me to my next point, and the real reason why these kind of exercises are important, which is that most of the harp music that students learn is made up of those three kinds of exercises: scales, chords, and arpeggio. They show up everywhere. But the thing is, if you don't know the pattern, then they're just a bunch of random notes that are much harder to connect in your mind, and for that reason, much harder to learn. But on the other hand, if you've mastered these type of patterns, your music becomes that much more accessible to you. After many years of having this same problem over and over again, of trying to teach these exercises orally and explain them and try to make notes, I decided enough was enough. That's it. I'm done. This is not acceptable anymore, okay? I decided if this dang book does not exist, then I'm making it myself, all right? Let's go. We're making it. Actually, I've already made it. But hold on. First thing I needed to do was figure out what actually needed to be in the book and what that would look like. So I spent a good amount of time researching the exam syllabi of the RCM and the ABRSM, which, by the way, I think are just wildly arbitrary. Like, for example, in the RCM, for scales, they format them so that you only ever cross under the fourth finger, which means that if you play more than one octave of a scale, you don't actually end on the octave. You play 2 octaves plus 1 note, which just why? Students can learn to cross with finger 3, and in fact, it's a very good skill to have. And I have a story related to this, actually. So when I was in high school and I was doing RCM exams, that's how I learned to play scales, only crossing finger 4, not landing on the octave. So when I got to university, I didn't know how to play scales any other way. And I remember being in a harp ensemble rehearsal, and the teacher was like, okay, everyone warm up, let's all play a C major scale. And I didn't know how to get it to land on C. And that's the moment when I learned that you could cross finger 3 under instead. And it was kind of embarrassing. So there's no need for that, okay? We can learn to play scales crossing finger 3 and finger 4. Then there's the ABRSM, which, again, just why? Like, why? You only have to learn scales and arpeggios and no chords. Like, it makes no sense to me, right? Because chords are already really difficult for harp students. So I don't know why, as an examining body. Either way, I don't know. Why would you not want someone to practice chords? Makes no sense. So what I did was I took kind of a general sense of what keys students were being asked to learn, what exercises, how fast, how many octaves for each grade. Also, though, I took into account my own teaching experience and also my experience as a professional player for what kinds of things that I felt were important to include. And the result is similar to exam requirements, but not exactly. So if you are a person that's doing an exam or your student's doing an exam, it's still a good idea to reference a syllabus for that exam that you're taking, rather than taking the exercise formats in the book that I made as an example of exam technique. I ended up making 3 volumes of this book, so it's actually multiple books. Each one gets a little bit more advanced than the one before. Each one includes a few more keys, a few more octaves for each exercises, listing faster metronome speeds, going from triads to 4-note chords, etc. The keys that I chose are keys that are playable on lever harps, so the final volume includes major and minor keys of up to 3 flats and up to 4 sharps. There are a few exercises in sharp minor keys that aren't playable or need adjustment on lever harp, but for the most part, it's very, very lever harp friendly. And as for the other keys that aren't included, so think, C flat major, F sharp major, those ones aren't in there, but I figure that by the time you've gotten through 3 volumes of this stuff, you'll probably be much better equipped to look up a key signature and apply the pattern of whatever exercise to a new key. And not to mention that volume 3 was already 43 pages long. So I thought that was long enough. So with all that decided, I got to work inputting all the notes, putting in fingerings and brackets, formatting, redoing brackets again because MuseScore resets them every time the formatting changes, which is extremely frustrating. I cannot tell you how long I spent struggling with brackets. And then there was things like putting in pedal diagrams, writing instruction pages, revising, etc., etc., etc. All in all, actually making these books took me over 40 hours. It was about twice as long as I expected it to be, but I did try really hard to make them easy to understand and easy to read. And now these books are available for you, so you can use them without having to spend 40 hours on it yourself. Dare I say you're welcome? Yes, you're welcome. So that's it. That's the book. Well, books. I really just cannot overstate the value that I believe there is in having this kind of resource book available, because, using this kind of book, students can not only get better at playing these patterns when they show up in their music all the time, but there are so many connections that start to get made about keys and key signatures, how that relates to their levers and pedals, how major and minor keys are related, what chords and their inversions are, comfort with different kinds of chords, so that if your student wants to get into playing lead sheets, they've got a good understanding of maybe not every chord, but a good number of chords, so they can try that out. And, I think theory applications too. You're maybe not learning all of the theory about scales and chords just by playing them out of the book, but I do think that if a student does want to go on to study theory, having some context for like, oh yeah, I know these different scales, and then learning, oh, this is why this scale is this way. Already knowing some of the key signatures, so again, it just doesn't feel like you're memorizing random stuff. This is definitely something I'm going to be using a lot in my own teaching and in my studio. And if it's something you'd like to use for yourself or for your students, all 3 volumes are available on my website, and there are links in the description for that. If you want more specific details about what exactly is in each book, that is detailed on the product page for each volume, so you can take a look at that again on my website. So that's my story about the missing book that I made myself because I could. And I hope that it's useful to some of you out there. And if not, that's totally fine too. But now at least it exists for whoever wants it. So happy harping, and maybe I'll see you around.